To some, sharing a copy of a printed knitting pattern is just the same as sharing a good book with a friend. And legally speaking, this may or may not be true. To others, this is a gray area with lots of weeds getting in the way of an underlying ethical issue. Last week, I shared commentary on this and provided my opinion that yes, this is very similar to sharing a copy of a book with a good friend. However, after reading through the comments from folks and speaking with a few designers about this issue, I've come to realize that there is more meat on this bone. And so for today's video, I want to explore this issue further and dive a little deeper into what it means to independent creators when we share their work. So get cozy and let's dive in. Hello, and welcome to a Wool Needles Hands bonus ramble. It is Sunday, and today is typically a day where I share my knitting podcast episodes. However, I wanted to dive into this with you right away, and so I'm adding it here as a bonus ramble. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Taylor, and I will be your host. Now, before we begin, I do want to emphasize here that I am not a lawyer and this is not legal advice. I did my own extensive research out of curiosity and with the intention of becoming a more informed consumer. I am providing my findings and opinions as just that. My findings and my opinions. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this is coming about out of my curiosity to dive further into this issue, and that curiosity was really fueled with some of the dialogue and conversations I was having with folks in the comment section of my controversial knitting opinions video. I love having conversations about these sorts of things, and the comments and conversation below that video were absolutely productive, respectful, and kind, and I think that that is fabulous. Well, one of the things that came up was what it really means when we casually share a knitting pattern with a friend. And my opinion was that if you have a physical copy of a printed knitting pattern, that it is okay to share that with a friend, similar to how it would be to share a copy of a book with a friend. I want to go into that further because there's a lot more going on there, and it's more important to give that topic a little more time in the sun than I was able to provide in that video last week. So I really want to get into this with you guys today. Now, this video is going to be relatively heavy with information and facts based on research that I have gathered, and I have provided all of those sources down in the description of this video if you would like to do some research yourself. However, I'm assuming you are here because you are a maker, a knitter, a crocheter, some kind of fiber enthusiast, and as that, I think it's important that we become informed consumers if we plan on supporting independent creators, knitwear designers, crochet designers, and the like. So I hope that you can take from this something interesting, learn something new, and develop a little bit more of a broader perspective about this issue. It's just important to understand these things so that we can fully support those independent creators and designers that we love so much. Now, for the context of today's video, I want to reiterate exactly where we're at with that. The context here is sharing a knitting pattern with another individual. Now, that could be sharing a knitting pattern with one individual or sharing a knitting pattern with several individuals. You could lump all of that in, but just to keep it simple, imagine sharing a knitting pattern with one single individual. And the knitting pattern is either in the form of a printed pattern publication, like what you see here, or in a digital file that you download from Ravelry or Lovecrafts, and you can print it out on your home printer, or you can knit from it from a tablet or something like that. So that's where we are. That's what we're getting into today. And before we can do that, we really need to cut through the weeds of the issue. We need to step into the briar and sort out some technicalities, some laws, rights, and one doctrine in particular that has made sharing printed works a thing we all do and value. When it comes to copyright law, as it relates to a physical copy of a written work being shared or sold, one thing that we really want to understand is the first sale doctrine. The first sale doctrine was first articulated in 1908 with a Supreme Court case of Bobbs-Merrill versus Straus. The issue here was whether or not copyright law was able to allow the owner of the copyright to prohibit the purchaser from reselling that item after that initial sale. What this means is, and what the first sale doctrine today really does for folks, is it allows them to sell a book that they have finished reading as a used book, or they can rent a book in a library. It provides those opportunities. If you were to walk into a bookstore and purchase a book, take it home and read it, love the book, and want to share it with a friend, you are allowed to do that because of the first sale doctrine. it is legal. And that is also why we have used bookstores and why we have libraries. They all are able to work that way because of the first sale doctrine. And it's important to understand this first sale doctrine when we call into question the legality of lending a printed, copyright protected book to somebody else. Now, as it relates to digital files, and because the majority of knitting patterns that we purchase today are in the form of a digital file that you purchase from Ravelry or Lovecrafts or Etsy or anything like that, it's important to understand that there is no first sale doctrine that covers digital files. And I think that's for good reason. Common sense would lead you to believe that this is a real slippery slope into digital file piracy, not unlike the Napster and the LimeWire of the 90s. If you allow a first sale doctrine to cover digital files, you really have to have a lot of regulations in place so that you don't have distribution and reproduction happening that can spiral out of control. So when it comes to sharing a digital file that you have purchased, there's nothing to protect you from the legality of that, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. In terms of making our own copies of a printed work or printing out multiple copies of a particular pattern, something that we really need to understand here are the rights afforded copyright owners as it relates to reproduction and distribution. The reproduction right is probably the most important right afforded to copyright owners under the Copyright Act, and what that protects the copyright owner from is illegal reproduction of their copyright protected work by others for either distribution or sale. It also protects them from something being reproduced and claimed as someone else's work. If we make photocopies of knitting patterns and provide them to others, even one additional person, you are violating the copyright owner's right of reproduction. And of course, we're starting to suggest ethical underlying issues here, and we are going to get into that later. The second exclusive right that is afforded to copyright owners that is relevant to what we're discussing today is the right of distribution. This provides the copyright owner the exclusive right to distribution, whether it be rental, sale, lending of their copyright protected works, and no one other than the copyright owner has that right. It's important to remember here, though, that this does not apply to one person purchasing a book, finishing the book, and selling or lending it to one additional person, as that one-to-one transaction, if you will, is protected under that first sale doctrine that I mentioned before. So now that we're well into the weeds, in order to determine whether it's legal to share a knitting pattern, we need to ask a few questions. The first being, is it a physical copy of a knitting pattern book? Kind of like the one that you see here. Technically speaking, it is legal thanks to the first sale doctrine. You are legally permitted to dispose of this any way that you see fit, whether it be donating it, selling it, sharing with a friend. That is protected under the first sale doctrine. So we are in the weeds right now, and technically speaking, yes, that is legal. Is it a printed copy of a knitting pattern? Kind of like this. A printed copy of a knitting pattern that originated as a digital file, but is being shared as a physical copy like this, meaning that the recipient is not receiving the digital file of the knitting pattern, they are simply receiving a physical printed copy of a knitting pattern on copy paper. This is a gray area and something I really can't answer legally speaking as a layperson. However, because the original owner of the knitting pattern most likely possesses the original file of the knitting pattern even after sharing the printed copy with a friend, I believe, based on some further research that I've done in the last week, that this is a violation of copyright law as it relates to distribution and reproduction. I find this to be, if not a legal issue, definitely an ethical one. The last question I want to ask here when it comes to determining if it is legal to share a paid-for knitting pattern is whether or not it is a digital file of a knitting pattern, like a PDF or a document that you have saved on your computer. The sharing of a digital file via person-to-person transfer, like email or attaching it to an email, is illegal, and it violates both the reproduction and the distribution rights that are exclusively afforded the copyright holder. It's important to note that there is nothing in place on a broad scale that prevents the owner from maintaining an original copy of the file after it has been shared or distributed, meaning that they also have a copy while other people, and that could be multiple people, have their own copy as well. That is a form of illegal distribution, and the copyright owner is protected under the copyright law from exactly that. Also important to remember here that when you share a digital file of a knitting pattern or a song or an audiobook or a book, when you share that file, the person who receives that file is getting an absolutely brand new version of that file bit for bit. There is no degradation of the product like it would be if you were sharing a book that you read from or buying a used book from a bookstore. There's obviously that status of it being used, which means that it has to be sold at a lower price point to make it reasonable. And also, it is a single copy that's being sold on a one-to-one basis, and that falls under the first sale doctrine. When you begin transferring files that you've paid for to people who have not paid for that and who have not provided revenue to the copyright owner, you are definitely violating those exclusive rights afforded the copyright owner. So sharing digital files that you've paid for is absolutely illegal. But see, this is what I mean by the weeds of the issues. When it all boils down to it, independent creators, not to mention the consumers, just don't have the machete to whack through it all. Whether a consumer is violating copyright law by sharing digital files, casually or unintentionally walking a fine line between what is legal and what is not by photocopying a pattern for a friend, or blatantly violating copyright law, most independent creators don't have the financial means to handle the situation in court. And that's the ultimate crux of the issue. If you don't have the financial means to tackle a violation of your copyright laws, what good are the copyright laws to you and whether or not people adhere to them? It kind of means that you have to rest a lot of your faith and trust on the ethics of your customers. And this is something that we all need to take into consideration as the consumers of independently created content. So regardless of whether or not a customer is violating copyright law by sharing a knitting pattern, the big question, and one that really needs to be explored by consumers that value the independent creative market, is whether sharing a knitting pattern in any given circumstance is ethical. Now, as we wade into what is ethical and what is not ethical, it is really up to you to determine what is ethical in your eyes and based on your value system. So what I'm going to share here is kind of my thoughts on what could be considered ethical and some things to consider to help provide some perspective to the issue. But always remember, ethics can be subjective, but I'm not here to tell you how to live your life. I'm here to provide you with some perspective. So as we get into the ethics of this issue, just know you might find this to be different in your opinion, and that is okay. I'm just sharing with you today, based on things that I have gathered and research that I have done, the perspective that I now have on the issue as a consumer of independent creative content. I think that the sharing of knitting pattern books, printed knitting pattern publications via libraries or online libraries or free libraries, things like that, to be perfectly acceptable. Those institutions are set up for us so that we can have access to copyright protected works in a way that is legal and affordable for a lot of folks. However, when it comes to sharing a book with a friend, that's where I have more considerations that I want to take into account before making that decision, and definitely putting that into a case-by-case scenario. Something to consider when it comes to the publication and release of a knitting pattern book by an independent knitwear designer who releasing knitting pattern books may or may not be their primary business model. So let's take, for example, a knitwear designer whose primary business model focuses on individual sale of individual patterns on platforms such as Ravelry or Lovecrafts, just as an example. To give you a little bit of an additional insight, when a book is released to the public, there's sort of a publication release window, kind of like the release window of a major motion picture. It's a period of time where the author is doing a lot of promotion, book signings, showing up and doing meet and greets, and it's during this window where a really good number of copies of the individual books are going to be sold. And it's also important to note that when you're having a book published by a publishing company, you receive an advance for that book. Now, you might receive a lump sum advance, for example, $10,000 all at once. You publish the book, you put it out into the world, and you work back your advance in royalties as the books begin to sell. Once you've worked back enough royalty to cover the advance that you were provided by the publishing company, then you can start reaping the benefits of those royalties right back into your pocket. Now, this is from a layman's perspective, and this is what I gather. If there is any additional information you have on how this works, I would definitely invite you to add that information down in the comment section. It's also important to note that there are some instances where craft book authors don't receive royalties. They receive one upfront check for a certain number of copies. When they receive their money, that relationship has ended in terms of money changing hands. So these are important things to consider, and it's hard to know which circumstance exists for which particular book author or knitting pattern designer. And what this means is that every sale of these knitting pattern books matters to these particular knitwear designers, as they are trying to earn back the advance that they received initially so that they can begin earning royalties for their books. Now listen, this is business. This is how business operates. When you put a product out into the world for people to buy, what they pay you is what's going to help keep the lights on and keep the business going. And if you want to help promote folks that are independently creating content, publishing books, knitting patterns, and because that's what we're talking about today, we're going to stick within that context, you want to support them any way that you can. To me, I value knitwear designers and the work that they put into the world, and I want to support them any way that I can, and many of you know that about me. And so it's important for me to understand this process, something I didn't really know very well before I started researching this issue and speaking to a few designers about this issue as well. But now that I do, it definitely makes me think twice when it comes to lending a book that was perhaps recently published and is still within that publication window when lots of things are going on and revenue is being built for that creator and the hype is alive. In fact, libraries who acquire new books to have in their inventory usually have a 4 to 6 week window before they have access to those books. And that is because they want to have that release window for the publishing company, for the author, before books are being provided for rent. So I guess if you really had to adhere to some standard as it relates to lending out your copies of knitting pattern books, if you feel so inclined to do that, maybe if it's a new book that just was released, give it some time, let it breathe before you hand it over to somebody else and potentially take a sale away from a designer or an independent creator. A 4 to 6 week window gives you a ballpark to work around and kind of gives you an idea of how something like that is managed in the library system. Now, this is a suggestion, and it's going to be what I adhere to in the future when it comes to potentially sharing a knitting pattern book. Now, I don't have a lot of opportunities for that, as I don't personally know a lot of knitters, but if it were to come up, I would definitely be keeping this in the back of my mind and basing my decision to share or not to share on these considerations and the conversations I've had and the information that I've gathered about this whole process, so that I can be sure I'm not taking away from a potential revenue source for a particular independent creator. What you do is entirely up to you, as this is not technically a legal issue, but I definitely think these are things worthy of your consideration. When it comes to sharing a printed copy of a digital download, this is really gray and may be a slippery slope to further copies being made and a somewhat significant to significant detrimental impact to the revenue stream of the designer. Independent knitwear designers most often rely on individual sales of individual knitting patterns on platforms such as Ravelry. Book deals that have advances and royalties are really not the norm for most of the independent knitwear designers that you patronize. As it relates to the ethics behind sharing digital files and digital content in a person-to-person transfer, in my opinion, this is unethical. Not only is it unethical, it is illegal, as it violates the copyright owner's exclusive rights to distribution and reproduction. However, most importantly, it's just simply unethical. There's no way for an independent knitwear designer to know this is happening, and they can't do much about it even if they recognize that it is. And even if they are able to attack an issue like this in court, it is expensive and it's not worth anybody's trouble to violate copyright law and take something away from a designer that is, like I said, their bread and butter and is what helps support their business. These individual sales on platforms such as Ravelry are the bread and butter of independent knitwear designers. And when this is compromised, even by casual pattern sharing of folks with no intention of taking revenue away from the designer, the revenue stream is interrupted, and that can be a really big deal when this is something that continues to happen or is seen as acceptable. If you already choose to support small businesses, and that's a very virtuous thing if you do, support independent makers in the same way. This is the mentality I will be carrying with me as I continue to be a ravenous consumer of knitting patterns and digital knitting content. Prioritize the independent makers and small businesses that you choose to follow. Support them fully and acknowledge that every little bit counts. When we build up our independent businesses and makers, we help bolster a stronger creative economy within our community, And that's a beautiful thing. I know that was full of information and probably not as jovial as some of my other midweek rambles and bonus rambles, but I so appreciate you if you stuck around and are here with me now for hearing me out on this. I have a much broader perspective on this issue. I have done a lot of research and spoken to people, and I just feel like a much more informed consumer. And that is such a big deal and a great thing. I hope you took something away from this and enjoyed yourself. And if you did, please don't forget to give the video a thumbs up, definitely subscribe, and click that bell icon to be notified anytime I upload new content here on the channel, which is every Wednesday and every Sunday. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your weekend. And until I see you again for Wednesday's episode of the Midweek Ramble, happy knitting, happy making, happy whatever it is that you're doing. Take care, be well, and I will see you soon. Bye.